So this week is Parshas Beshalach. Parshas Beshalach is Shiras Hayam, but today we will be discussing a mitzvah which is so relevant to all of us. And I usually prefer discussing mitzvahs which are part of our daily or weekly routine of Avodas Hashem. What is Krias HaTorah all about? Krias HaTorah, Monday, Thursday, Shabbos. Right after Bnei Yisrael said Shiras Hayam, Vayasa Moshe es Yisrael miyam suf, vayetzu el midbar shur, vayelchu shloshes yomim bamidbar, velo matzu mayim. There were 3 days wandering in the desert and they didn't find water. And Chazal's pshat in this pasuk is interesting. Source number 1 on our sheet. Asonat tekones tiken Ezra. שקודם במנחה בשבס וקודם בשני וחמישי. And the Gemara asks, והוא מעיקורה ומתקנה. This tekona comes way before Ezra. דסניה, וילכו 3 ימים במדבר ולא ימצאו מים. דור שרישומס אמרו, אין מים אלא תורה. שנאמר, Hoy kol tzom elachol hamayim, kiven sheholchu 3 yomim b'lo Torah, nil'u. They became exhausted and tired and weak, shvach. Amdu neviim shebeneim v'tiknu lem sheyeh kodem b'Torah, b'Shabbos, b'Sheni, v'Chamishi, kedei shelo yalinu 3 yomim b'li Torah. So neviim shebeneim, right after Krias Yamsuf, were metaken Krias HaTorah. So how could you say Ezra was the one? And the Gemara answers, Nevi'im Shebeneim were metaken the original tekana, but their tekana was a minimal one. 3 people each reading 1 pasuk, or 1 person reading 3 psukim. Ezra expanded that tekana, and he was metaken a minimum of 10 psukim, and 3 people that are oila l'Torah. So the original tekana was from earlier generations, Nevi'im Shebeneim Dor HaMidbar, right after Krias Yamsuf and Shiras Hayam, but Ezra filled in. The Yerushalmi seems to have a different opinion, and that's in Perek Daled of Masechet Megillah. Yerushalmi says, Moshe tiken liyisrael sheyeh kodem b'Torah b'Shabbos v'yom tovim rosh chodesh u'chodesh shel moed. Ezra hitkin sheyeh kodem b'Torah sheni v'chamishi v'b'Shabbos b'mincha. According to Yerushalmi, we notice 2 differences between the Yerushalmi and the Bavli. When the Bavli says Nevi'im Arishonim, Nevi'im Shebeneim Tiknu, the Yerushalmi says Moshe Rabbeinu. And while the Bavli says that Nevi'im Shebeneim were metaken Sheni v'Chamishi, not only Shabbos, the Yerushalmi says no. Moshe Rabbeinu was metaken Mikroi Kodesh, Shabbos, Yom Tov, Rosh Chodesh, and Chol HaMoed. Ezra was metaken Sheni v'Chamishi. There's Yerushalmi, the beginning of Masechet Megillah, and the Yerushalmi seems to be l'shitosoi. Probably some of you remember the first Mishnah Megillah, Megillah Nekreis, B'Yud Gimel, Yud Aleph, Tezvov, Tezayin, Lo Pochas v'Lo Yoisar. B'nei HaKforim Magdimim Liyoim HaKnisa. People lived in little towns and little hamlets, and many of them had neither Krias HaTorah nor Mikra Megillah. Echod Be'ir, Shnayim B'Kfar, and they used to come into the big city Monday and Thursday to hear Krias HaTorah. So Chazal were metaken, when they come in anyway, they should also be able to read the Megillah. And they shouldn't need to come in twice, come specially. The Yerushalmi asks, Yom HaKnisa means they come in to hear Krias HaTorah. Ezra was metaken Krias HaTorah. Mordechai and Esther were many years before Ezra. So how could you say that Mordechai and Esther were metaken Magdim and Yom HaKnisa? There wasn't a Yom HaKnisa in their days because it's only Ezra that was metaken Sheni v'Chamishi. According to the Bavli, no, Nevi'im Shebeneim were metaken Sheni v'Chamishi, as they just expanded it. So what's the Yerushalmi's kasha? obviously Yerushalmi l'shitosoi. Moshe Rabbeinu was only metaken Shabbos, Yom Tov, Rosh Chodesh, Chol HaMoed, which is fundamentally Mikroi Kodesh. And the Yerushalmi bases it on the Pasuk, Vaydaber Moshe's Moyadei Hashem al Bnei Yisrael. Moyadei Hashem, Sheni v'Chamishi is not Moyadei Hashem. So Yerushalmi l'shitosoi. However, the Rashba and the Ritva want to reconcile the Bavli and Yerushalmi, and they give an interesting pshat. In the days of Moshe Rabbeinu, there was Krias HaTorah Sheni v'Chamishi, but it didn't seem so important to people. One person was Oila, 3 psukim, was very minimal. So the Bnei Kfurim didn't bother to come into the city. It was only after the Takon of Ezra, which Krias HaTorah Sheni v'Chamishi seemed to have more importance, more significance. There were 3 people that were Oila the Torah. The Kriya was somewhat more lengthy, 10 psukim. So, yes, Moshe was metaken Sheni v'Chamishi as well. But in those days, the Bnei Kfurim didn't come in, and that is the kasha of the Yerushalmi. However, why wouldn't we simply say Yerushalmi l'shitosoi? Because the other Yerushalmi in Perek Dalet clearly says, Moshe Rabbeinu had nothing to do with Sheni v'Chamishi because it's Vayedaber Moshe's Moadei Hashem el Bnei Yisrael. So the kasha of the Yerushalmi would be Yerushalmi l'shitosoi. Rambam, Moshe Rabbeinu tikan lem le'Yisrael she'yeh kodim b'Torah b'Rabim b'Shabbos b'Sheni v'Chamishi b'Shachas kedei shelo yishu shlosh yomim b'Lishmias HaTorah. Where does the Rambam find that Moshe Rabbeinu was metaken? The Bavli says Nevi'im shebeinehem. My feeling would be, why make a machlokes Bavli and Yerushalmi? The Yerushalmi says Moshe tiken. The Bavli says Nevi'im shebeinehem. The Bavli is also based on the Pasuk V'yasem Moshe es b'nei Yisrael. So the Kesef Mishnah, it's a bit lengthy, but the fourth line from the top. V'klape masha omro, omdu neviim v'tikno, kosev Rabbeinu, Moshe Rabbeinu, olav hasholom, shu hoyu hanovi hagodol, v'kol haneviim shebedor beis din oihu. V'oid shelo yosedo v'ela baskamosoi. V'im kein, elav ra'ui liyacheis ho'inyan. V'oi degasin b'Yerushalmi v'kosev arav Moshe Rabbeinu tikan liYisrael. Toras Chaim. Who knows what Toras Chaim is? Obviously, it's a great yeshiva, but it's also a great sefer. Toras Chaim was written 350 years ago. The yeshiva is not on his name, but rather on one of the present-day Gedolim, Reb Chaim Kreisvirt. But Toras Chaim was written by Reb Avram Chaim Shor, who lived 350 years ago. He was a brother of the Tevuas Shor, and Shor was a very famous rabbinical dynasty. So the Toras Chaim is one of the Choshevs Tesvarim in Pshat, and that is why most yeshiva bochum today are not even aware of this sefer. The Chazon Ish complains in one of his letters that we stopped learning Marsha. And since we stopped learning Marsha, people no longer feel a tam in Pshat. So the Toras Chaim Abova Kama Pei Beis writes that this takona, Krias HaTorah Sheni v'Chamishi b'Shabbos, was put into place after Moshe Rabbeinu passed away. Olo b'sara hashamayim. And l'choira, the lashon of the Gemara Nevi'im shebeineim would support his argument. If it's Moshe Rabbeinu, why would Chazal use a sprach, a lashon Nevi'im shebeineim? Moshe Rabbeinu, the Rambam writes, "Oyu over leNevi'im lekodmem lefonov uleboim achrav." No other Navi compared to Moshe Rabbeinu. If this was a Tekov of Moshe Rabbeinu, would Chazal ignore Moshe Rabbeinu and write the Nevi'im were metaken? It seems so unlikely. The Yerushalmi clearly says Moshe Rabbeinu, but the Bavli doesn't. But the argument of the Torah Chaim, and I want you to argue against the argument of the Torah Chaim, the Torah Chaim says, Sefer Torah that is missing one letter is a Sefer Apostle. As long as Moshe Rabbeinu was alive, the Sefer Torah was missing 8 words. Vayom Hashem Moshe Eved Hashem Lo Yinas Leichai. So the Sefer wasn't the Sefer Kosher. How could it be Makayim Krias HaTorah, an apostle of Sefer? And that is why he argues this takana was only instituted Lacha Moshe Rabbeinu. And because the Torah Chaim is more pshat, he doesn't quote the Rambam. Because these form, the Mashal never quotes the Rambam. These form were al adaf. But the Rambam does write Moshe Rabbeinu as a Yerushalmi. So why do you think this is not such a strong argument? As a Sefer Apostle, it's missing 8 words. What do you say? As long as Moshe was alive, that was what it was, and that was a shleimus dika Sefer Torah. Argument number 2. What? Oh, so you say Moshe was masakin, but he said, "Wait till I die." Maybe it's a bit unlikely, but maybe. I want to hear a more powerful argument. Okay, there are 2 opinions in the Gemara, whether Yeshua writes those psukim or Moshe Kosev Bedema. So Rashi writes Kosev Bedema, he wrote those psukim while he was crying. The Riyah Kodesh said Dema is like Dimua, like Teroivis. The letters were just in a different sequence. And it didn't really write V'yomes Shel Moshe Eved Hashem. But I want to hear a very simple argument. Who says that the takon of Moshe Rabbeinu was to read out of a kosher Sefer Torah? Adayin lo nitnu Torah. The mitzvah of Kisva Lachem Es Hashira wasn't given yet. And the takana was learn Torah 3 times a week, Sheni v'chamishi v'Shabbos. And the Bach says Lahedya b'Simen Tov Reish Pei that the takon of Moshe Rabbeinu and the Nevi'im was Lekro Bal Peh. They didn't have any Sifrei Torah yet. Adayin lo nitnu Torah. So this is not a very powerful argument. It's a Apostle of Sefer Torah, and you can't read from a Apostle of Sefer Torah. So, this was the takana. Shelo yelchu gimel yamim b'li Torah. One of the fundamental questions in Hilchas Krias HaTorah, Choivas Tzibur or Choivas HaYochid? And this question is relevant primarily when people are on planes, on flights, and they daven on the plane, but they still come into town when it's before Sov Zman Tefillah, and the Zichar Moshe is still Chap a minyan with Krias HaTorah. So if a person daven b'yechidus for any reason, legitimate or not, does he have a chiyuv to go to shul to hear Krias HaTorah? Is Krias HaTorah upon every individual? You can't learn the sefer only if you have a minyan. But it's upon every individual to look for a minyan and to hear Krias HaTorah. Or maybe it's Choivas HaTzibur. And it's not a chiyuv an individual. It is a chiyuv when 10 people daven together, they have a chiyuv of Krias HaTorah. And if that is the basis of the halacha, then a yochid that was on a plane and he already davened doesn't have a chiyuv to come to shul to Krias HaTorah, because it's not upon the individual. It's upon the minyan. It's upon the tzibur. And this is a very fundamental question with many rayas lekan ulekan. Berchas Shmuel in Yevomis. And don't ask me why it's in Yevomis. Kach darcha shel Torah. Shomati mepi moiri v'Rabbi Kedosh Yisrael. Who was that? Who was that? Reb Chaim Brisker. So the Berchas Shmuel, Reb Baruch Ber, was one of the greatest talmidim of Reb Chaim Brisker. I had a close relationship with Rabbi Yankov Kamenetsky. And Agon Rabbi Yankov Kamenetsky was Zeichel Arichas Yomim. He almost felt like a chaver of Reb Baruch Ber. And I once heard an interesting comment. Reb Baruch Ber was so dovek in his Rebbe, I would say like the Maggid of Mezrich was dovek in the Baal Shem Tov. And whatever he learned, it was all in his Rebbe's teachings. And Rabbi Yankov Kamenetsky commented to me that the yeshiva world lost a lot because of the dveikus of Reb Baruch Ber Reb Chaim. He was such a genius. If he would develop his own mahalach and learning, maybe we would have more than the fact that he was entirely meshubed just to be an interpreter of Reb Chaim Brisker. Is he right or not? Maybe. But it's an interesting comment of God will be Yisrael. That's what Rabbi Yankov said. Anyway. Shamati mepi moire v'Rabbi Kedosh Yisrael. Schisa yogan oleinu. That is usually the way Hasidim write, not usually the way Litvisher writes. Schisa yogan oleinu Kedosh Yisrael. But that was a Baruch Ber. He really had a Hasidish neshama. לעניין, אם ההנה רויב מדין רובה ככולה לצירף הסורה בקריאס התוירה תולה בחודש סבורה. So this is Svara Mukha, Reb Chaim said. יש לחקור בכל אחד מדינם אלו. מה דבעינן הסורה בכל אחד מהדינם הוא אלו. And he means קריאס התוירה, נשיאס כפיים, חזורס השעץ, אם החייב של קריאס התוירה ומיקרו מגילה וחזור ששעץ חל על הסורה ביחד דווקא, וכל זמן דלק הסורה לכחיוב כלל של קריאס התוירה, או לא, דנאמר שהחייב של קריאס התוירה ומיקרו מגילה וששעץ הוא אפילו על אחד, דדינו דאינן המרס אלו בסורה. ואומר, דאם נוימד החיוב נעשה דווקא על ידי הסורה ביחד, לא שייך דין רובוי ככולוי, לכחיוב. If it's chayvus tzibur, you need a tzibur that's chayiv in Krias HaTorah. And if you don't have 10 people that are chayiv Krias HaTorah, there is no chiyuv. But if the chiyuv is on every yochid, it's just a detail in the halacha that you can't perform this chiyuv ela basora, then we would say ruboy kekuloi. Ruboy kekuloi is a huge sugya. And I wrote about it in length. And it's not a sugya we'll be discussing this morning, but this is an interesting ha'ara. Lemaskona de Milsa, Krias HaTorah is totally different than Chazor Seshatz and Mikra Megillah. Mikra Megillah is clearly a choyves hayochid. And if you don't have a minyan, you're still chayiv a Mikra Megillah and you say a bracha. Chazor Seshatz is clearly choyves hatzibur. Not the original Chazor Seshatz. The original Chazor Seshatz that Chazal Mortaken, Lahoitzias Misha Einoi Boki. Tefillah is definitely Choyves HaYochid. But Chazor Seshatz today, when everybody already davened, is Choyves HaTzibur. Mikra Megillah is a question. Krias HaTorah is a question. Mikra Megillah is Choyves HaYochid. Chazor Seshatz Choyves HaTzibur. Krias HaTorah, that's a matter of doubt. And Reb Chaim says, if it's Choyves HaTzibur, there is no Ruba Kikoloi. If you don't have 10 people that are Chayiv, there is no Tchilas HaChiyuv. But he didn't state a clear opinion. What does Reb Chaim hold? So there's a famous story. Reb Chaim was a younger man, and who knows who Reb Chaim's Shver was? His wife was the daughter of, she was the daughter of Rabbi Rafal Shapira, the Torah Sephor, who was the son-in-law of the Netziv. Reb Chaim was almost as old as his Shver. He was an Alter Bocha, like the Minig in Lithuania in those days. So the story goes, Reb Chaim was living one flight under his shver. And one day, we don't know why, he davened b'yechidus, and he called together a minyan in his home for Krias HaTorah. And there was a tzeinter missing. You know what a tzeinter is. One person was missing. So he asked the Shver to come down and be Metzaref, and the Shver said no. He didn't come down. And the Shver said, why are you pestering me? Why are you bothering me? It's a choivis etzibur. If you don't have 10 people, you don't have a chiyuv. I'm sure that Rebbe Rafon Shapira admired his son-in-law. If I would have a son-in-law by Reb Chaim Brisker, I would be the happiest person in the world. And don't get me wrong, I love my sons-in-law. I have 6 of them, and they're all great, but none of them is Reb Chaim Soloveitchik. So why didn't he come down? Probably lahoires halocha. Lahoires halocha. And he felt it's a choivis etzibur. And if you don't have a minyan, you put on Krias HaTorah. Sit and learn. Nemarosa Gemara. You don't need to. So this story says that Reb Chaim holds that it's choivis hayochid. And you need to bring together a minyan. Or maybe not. So what was very well known in the yeshiva world, Hagedolim lebeis brisk, the Beis Halevi, Reb Chaim, the Biskarov, and so on. Besides the godless betoira, the Diktuk HaMitzvah and the Yiras Shamayim was legendary. So even if Kriyas HaTorah is choivis hatzibur, but it's definitely something extremely significant. After all, it's a takon of Moshe Rabbeinu. We don't have many takonas of Moshe Rabbeinu. Who remembers another takon of Moshe Rabbeinu? I will be pleasantly surprised if you would remember. First Rambam in Hilchos Ovel. So the reason you don't remember, because it's not a Bavli, it's only Yerushalmi. So you probably only remember the Bavli. So that's why you don't remember this halacha. Because it's nowhere in the Bavli, only Yerushalmi, Perek Hamed Ksubis, Moshe Tiken Shivas Yemei Avelus. And that's the first Rambam in Hilchos Ovel. So the fact that Reb Chaim Brisker went out of his way to bring together a minyan doesn't necessarily prove that he felt it's a choivis hayochid. Maybe it's a choivis hatzibur, but it's a gevaldige inyan. It's a takon of Moshe Rabbeinu. So this is a question. Is Kriyas HaTorah al hatzibur, or is it al kol yochid v'yochid? So Reb Chaim says, what would be the nafka mina? Rubai kekuloi. If you have 6 people that didn't carry Kriyas HaTorah, could you bring another few in? So if Reb Chaim asked the Shver to come down and be mitzdaref, that would prove, that in itself would prove that it's a choivis yochid, because otherwise Reb Chaim says divrei atzmon. Reb Chaim says, if it's a choivis hatzibur, you need 10 people that didn't hear Kriyas HaTorah. And if he asks the Shver to come down, that does prove that Reb Chaim held it's a choivis yochid, and therefore we say ruboi kikuloi. Not from the fact that he went out of his way to have a minyan and have Kriyas HaTorah, but from the fact that he asked his Shver to be mitzdaref, even though he wasn't mechuyev. That would prove that Reb Chaim held Kriyas HaTorah is choivis hayochid. So this is a very interesting discussion. So this week I brought, because this is such an interesting discussion, I brought some Kontrasim, in which this sugi is more expanded. I just brought about 15, so kol hakoydim zocha. And if anybody takes a kontras, you could share it with your chaverim. So the pasuk says, "V'yasa Moshe es bnei Yisrael miyamsu v'yetzu al midbar Shur v'yerchu shloshes yomim b'midbar v'lo yimatzu mayim." And Chazal say, 3 days without Torah, and they were falling apart. This is a generation that saw a revelation greater than all the Nevi'im. Rasu shivchu alayam, mashal leroy Yecheskel v'kol ha-Nevi'im. And Chazal say, hoyu marin be'etzba. They pointed a finger and they said, Ze keli v'anveyu. They were at such an unbelievably high madrega. Va'afal piken, 3 days without Torah, v'nilu. we would expect they were like the Nevi'im. They were greater than the Nevi'im. They just experienced a revelation, Shaloi hoyo kemoisoi. Va'afal piken, 3 days without Torah, and everything was falling apart, which shows the importance of Talmud Torah. You could be zeicher to the greatest madregas, but without Talmud Torah, nothing is guaranteed, and it is impossible. There'll be 3 days without Talmud Torah, which proves the importance and the significance of Talmud Torah, not only in the lives of individuals, but in the life of Klal Yisrael. So the Prima Godem asks a question in the beginning of Siman Kuf Lamed Hey. Did they go 3 days without Torah? Krias Shachas V'Aretz. And the Gemara says, Yoitze v'ogisa v'yoyme v'alayla with Krias Shema. Who remembers where that Gemara is? Afir lo korei la Krias Shema Shachas V'Aretz yotzi yedei choyves lo yom sefer HaTorah zeh mepicho. Where's that Gemara? It's like you know. How many times in Shas? Huh? Menachas Tzadik Tes and Medoram Dav Chesed Medalef. So Prima Godem asks, they weren't 2 to 3 days without Torah. I think the answer is a simple one. Let's have a look at the Rambam again. Moshe Rabbeinu tikelem liyisod sheyeh koydem b'Torah berabim b'Shabbos sheni v'chemishi. Talmud Torah berabim. Kriyas Shema, everybody said on his own. And you have a lot of time for Kriyas Shema. Mishiyakir ad sof gimel shois. Meplaga mincha ad alois hashachar. The takana was sheyeh oiskim b'Torah together. Sheyeh oiskim b'Torah berabim. Talmud Torah berabim. That's what keeps us going. So despite the fact there was zeicher to a gilu which was greater than Yechezkel v'kol HaNaviim, that is not enough. Without Talmud Torah, we lose everything. And then they finally found water, but they couldn't drink because the water was bitter. V'yoreu Hashem eitz, v'yashlech b'toich hamayim, v'yimteku hamayim. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu shows Moshe Rabbeinu wood. Moshe throws the wood into the water, and the water becomes sweet. HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't tell Moshe what to do with that wood. V'yoreu Hashem eitz. So why and did Moshe understand he needs to put the eitz into the water? The Chasam Sofer explains what was the story about. The water was bitter, and the eitz made it sweet. The Chasam Sofer says water is Torah. Ein mayim ela Torah. So the water is symbolic of Lomdei Torah. Eitz is symbolic of Machzikei Torah. Eitz chayim hu lemachazikim ba. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted to show Moshe that there will come a time in which there will be many Lomdei Torah. But if there will be a lack of Machzikei Torah, support for Torah, it'll be bitter. And that is why HaKadosh Baruch Hu shows Moshe eitz, to show that if we have Lomdei Torah, we need Machzikei Torah. But the Chasam Sofer doesn't say, so why did he throw the eitz into the water? So recently, I spoke to a big group of Choshav Balabatim in America that came together in Eretz Yisrael for Chizuk. And people that are maybe the greatest Machzikei Torah of our generation. People that give millions upon millions just to keep the Torah world going. And I gave them Chizuk. And I said, to support Torah, you need to appreciate Torah. To appreciate Torah, you need to love Torah. To love Torah, you need to learn Torah. So the real Zvulans are the ones that are also, to a certain degree, Yisachars. So Moshe understands, okay, having water here and eitz there is not enough. The eitz needs to be in the water. Machzikei Torah are those people that themselves learn Torah and love Torah, and they could understand and appreciate how important Torah is in our lives as individuals, as kehilas, as communities, and as a people. So when HaKadosh Baruch Hu shows Moshe the eights, Moshe understands, V'yashlich el torch hamayim and v'yimteku hamayim. So Baruch Hashem, how important Talmud Torah the Rabbim is. This is a generation that had the most amazing revelation of all, but without Torah, they could not survive. And the Rambam says, what was the Takana? She'iyah koyrem b'Torah b'Rabbim, b'Sheni v'Chameshi, and that is what yeshivas are all about. Everybody can learn at home, but the real Torah is Torah de Rabbim, and that is Talmud Torah b'Yeshiva. And that is why Chazal teach us in Yom Edav Chav Ches. Avraham Zokan v'Yoshev b'Yeshiva, Yitzchak Zokan v'Yoshev b'Yeshiva, Yankov Zokan v'Yoshev b'Yeshiva, U'miyameyem shel avoseinu lo ypaska Yeshiva mehem. Yeshivas is what keeps us alive. So Baruch Hashem, thank you, Kodesh Baruch Hu, we have the privilege to learning in a great yeshiva, in Yeshiva's Torah's Chaim, Ki heim chayenu, v'oirech yomeinu, u'behem nega yoyim v'laylo. Good Shabbos.